give it to you. He gon' give it to you.
But let's transition and get to the reason why we're really here. And that's to talk about two very, very important films to the comic book film, live action film genre. We're concluding our podcast series today, Marvel's 20th Century Fox era, by none other than recapping and revisiting Deadpool and Deadpool 2. These are the last films we're going to talk about in this series. Of course, in the lead up to Deadpool and Wolverine, which is going to drop in about 9 days here, 8 days. It's kind of crazy that we're already here. It's very, very close. But before we dive into the films individually and start to reminisce and just recap our experiences and feelings about these movies, let's just start off with a bit of a general introduction and discussion about Deadpool as a character in live action and just, sort of the journey that we've been on. We talked a lot about the introduction of the character in live action with XMen Origins Wolverine a couple of weeks ago, which really set the stage for any of this to even be possible and set the stage for Ryan Reynolds to become this mega superstar by donning the costume of the Merc with the Mouth and ultimately really taking the reins of this character and making it entirely in his image and catapulting him to a level of superstardom now. But what do you just want to start off and talk about with your relationship to Deadpool as a character, particularly with these movies, and then of course just Ryan Reynolds and how important he's been to the role, and obviously I think what he has done not only himself as an actor and as a producer, but also what the films have done within the context of the genre and how they sort of changed things over the past eight or so years.
Man, this dude, Ryan Reynolds. So Deadpool as a character in general, it's so weird how I found him. I think the first time I had ever seen Deadpool was actually on a shirt. That's the first time I had ever seen Deadpool. I was like, man, this dude looks a lot like Spider-Man, but not Spider-Man. who is this guy? And I actually ended up buying the shirt after doing some research. Pretty sure it was a Hot Topic shirt, and I had a Deadpool shirt like early high school, and you know what I mean. People didn't even know Deadpool back then, but I was like, I got hit, man. I read up on him and figured out who the character was, and I was like, whoa, this dude is funny. Up until that point, I hadn't been reading funny comics. And when you first get into comic books, a lot of people aren't reading the funny comics, right? A lot of people are reading like, oh, what's the cool shit? Like, oh, what's that? This dude got stabbed by something. There's power blast and all kind of stuff. Not Deadpool. Deadpool was so different. And so that was like my very, very, again, early introduction with the character. And so catching up with those comics, seeing his interaction with everybody, with Spider-Mans, with X-Men, really those two in particular, with random Spider-Man things and then his random X-Men things. That's really the comics I was seeing and catching up with. But then moving on to the films, Deadpool 1 is just almost like a culmination of who I knew Ryan Reynolds to be, I guess. Like, Ryan Reynolds is an actor where, like, The Proposal is randomly one of my favorite movies. I know. It's just like a random rom-com. Ryan Reynolds is in it. But that's who I knew him as for a long time, as like the guy in The Proposal, the guy who did Green Lantern. Of course, he's a funny guy. But again, he was only in Origins that we talked about not that long. They messed him up, which by that time I knew how they messed him up. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? This is weird. And come full circle to these movies, Ryan Reynolds has literally reshaped everything I think we are to know about the character. Being able for this character to succeed, I think through comics is one thing, right? Very fourth wall breaking. That's okay. He's been doing that for years, right? A very long time. But to be able to do it, I think on a cinematic level, I think was so different and brought so much to the genre of what we thought comic book movies were supposed to be. And Ryan Reynolds, it's so funny because he had been playing Deadpool for so long because he is Ryan Reynolds. He is that character. He just constantly, every movie he's in, Hitman's Bodyguard, I don't know, you name it, he's just a very quippy person. That's literally how he acts. And so him kind of squeezing into Deadpool was so accurate. And even, I guess maybe even they seen something back in Origins. You know what I mean? They even made me seem like, man, this dude, he kind of acts just like him, but we couldn't tell. They didn't have him on screen for that long. But by the time we get to this movie and it comes out, man, he is just, I think, firing on all cylinders. Like you said, as a producer, as somebody who was who was just able, I think, to shape this character and be so, I think, conscious as well of knowing himself and knowing the character. Like, oh, where maybe I need to do this better as Deadpool. But this part is myself. I might not need to focus on this part as much either. I guess just marrying those two worlds, I think, was impressive to me. Not only that, but man, everything surrounding this movie, marketing and all those other things. But yeah, man, that's my relationship with Deadpool, the character. Kind of found him weird. I didn't find him reading a comic or anything. I'm just like, huh, who's this guy on the shirt? And now we have Ryan Reynolds in these two movies again, kind of just, I think, kind of reinventing what comic book comedy even is supposed to be like. Nevertheless, Deadpool as a character.
I don't think a lot of people found Deadpool reading the comics. It's not like he was the most popular character, but I think oftentimes he was always included in other media, other tie-ins, and that's how I discovered him as well. I think it might have been, to be honest, I think the first time truly that I really even like understood Deadpool as a character was that X-Men Origins Wolverine movie. Like that was really kind of the first time, but it was shortly around that time too that he was included in a couple of video games. The character was included in a couple of video games. I think he was included in an X-Men game that I had. There was a Xbox game that I definitely played a couple of times that came out, and it was like, oh, this is like a really irreverent, funny, hilarious type of character that's just totally different than everybody else that you might read in a comic book. But obviously the movies just catapulted the character of Deadpool to a new stratosphere of success because they were starting to do things that had just not been explored in the medium before. I mean, by 2016, when Deadpool comes out, comic book films are the dominant form of entertainment in Hollywood. They are the highest grossing movies at the box office. We've talked about quite a number of them in this series of podcast episodes, but it was also, to a lot of audiences, possibly becoming somewhat stale and somewhat redundant because we were starting to see tropes develop, some similar things emerge and similar characteristics across movies. I mean, that stuff was starting to rear its ugly head definitely by 2016. And I think when Deadpool comes along and offers something that feels just totally fresh and invigorating, that's something that everybody wanted to get on board with. And it ultimately influence a slew of other films and television shows that would come after it, so much so that even now to this day, I think people are still comparing new properties, new live action films, new animated shows that come out. They're comparing it to the comedy, the style, the irreverent nature of Deadpool, just because of what that film was able to do in a time where the Fox X-Men franchise was on a downturn. Let's be honest about it. Like, they came off of Days of Future Past, a big win, but as we talked about in last week's episode, Apocalypse, very shaky movie, not a great outing for them. And also the questions and the rumors about a potential sale to Disney were popping up at this time during the development of these Deadpool movies. And so I think people were just like really curious, like, is this gonna even be a thing any longer? Is this franchise going to be around? But Deadpool gave them probably an extra 3 years of life that they otherwise wouldn't have had if it wasn't for Ryan Reynolds and what his team put together here. But I think overall now, Deadpool, in the lexicon of everything that we've gotten, we look at him with high regard, because that was definitely a shot of adrenaline that the genre needed in 2016, that they carried on in 2018, of course, with the sequel. But let's go ahead and officially dive into these movies. And we're going to start off things, of course, with Deadpool, which came out in 2016. But as we've talked about a couple of weeks ago, the development on this movie began well before 2016. By February of 2004, David S. Goyer, writer and director, and Ryan Reynolds were starting to work on a Deadpool movie at New Line Cinema. They worked together, ironically enough, on another Marvel movie, Blade Trinity. Not a great movie, but Ryan Reynolds was interested in the part of Deadpool after learning that in the comics, the character refers to his appearances as a cross between Ryan Reynolds and a Shar-Pei, which is a dog breed. And so he found that pretty funny, and it made him interested in the character. New Line Cinema executive Jeff Katz, who thought Reynolds was the only actor suitable for the role, championed the idea of a movie. However, there were some rights issues, of course, with all of these movies with 20th Century Fox and their X-Men films. And ultimately, at that time, the project did not move forward. But a little movie called X-Men Origins Wolverine came around, and that really just kind of changed the trajectory of all of this. Reynolds learned that Fox had expressed interest in a film featuring Deadpool, and the character was set to make an appearance in the 2009 film X-Men Origins Wolverine. Ryan Reynolds was cast in the part. His role was ultimately expanded during the film's production because they were so impressed with his work, and Katz was an executive at Fox at that point and said that Deadpool was, quote, nicely set up to be explored in his own way in a future film, end quote. The film's portrayal deviates from the original comic character. I think that's obvious, imbuing him with several superpowers and sewing his mouth shut. Turned out to be a big mistake on their part. But after the successful opening of X-Men Origins Wolverine, Fox officially began development on a solo Deadpool movie with Ryan Reynolds attached to star, and X-Men producer Lauren Schuler Donner involved as well. The spinoff was set up to ignore the events of the Wolverine version and return to the character's roots with a slapstick tone and a, quote, propensity to break the fourth wall, end quote. We kind of talked about this in the X-Men Origins Wolverine episode, but let's revisit this conversation. I mean, how important was it that ultimately what we saw in that Wolverine movie, that depiction of Deadpool, how important was it that it failed to ultimately give us what we got, all these years later? It's kind of crazy to think about it in that way, but the failure of that depiction of Ryan Reynolds in that movie, if we didn't get that, if it didn't bomb so hard and become such a negative thing amongst audience goers, we may not have ever seen a solo Deadpool movie, because I think that there was a true desire and really a need on the part of Fox to say, we actually got to go back and revisit and get this right.
What's so interesting, I think that whole idea that you just said is going to be the essence of Deadpool and Wolverine. Like, damn, we fucked up a lot of shit. Like, let's go retcon some of that stuff. Let's go talk about it. Let's heal from it and move on. I think that's literally the whole movie, like a funny therapy session, I think is what Deadpool and Wolverine is going to be. But like you said, it all starts here with Origins. We kind of had to have this weird depiction of Deadpool in order to get to where we were. And it's also weird because it comes full circle in the way that's Deadpool as a character, to make fun of things like this, to kind of figure out like, whoa, y'all did what? Break the fourth wall, do something ridiculous, and talk about it. And it's so interesting because I just can't imagine where we would be without that. We wouldn't have a Deadpool movie, like you said. This had to happen in order to get us to where we are. This character had to be treated bad because, again, the essence of Deadpool, it's like he's being treated both bad in writing, in real life, and in the movie itself. It's crazy how that works out. That like they failed at both, and without failing at both, we might not be here. But yeah, I'm. It's weird to say, but I'm happy they failed Deadpool in that way, and in that movie, X-Men Origins, man. Such a weird way to get here, but it's kind of it kind of turned out in our favor, and I'm really thankful for it.
So it's a little poetic, you sometimes you got to go through the mud to get to the other side to become better for it. And again, with just the development of comic book films in the 2000s, and we've talked a lot about this, they were still finding their way. We were still trying to figure this whole thing out because they were still somewhat of a new proposition in terms of becoming recurring mainstream entertainment, big budget tentpoles that were being made by studios on a pretty frequent basis. And you're not always going to get it right the first time. In fact, sometimes you will just outright fail, which is what they did in that movie. It was a pure failure pretty much on every aspect of what the character could be, and just I think what people would associate Deadpool as. But it definitely allowed for a new opportunity and a door to be open to say, like, all right, well, let's go ahead, regroup, figure this out, and try to return and make sure that we can get this right if we do get another chance. But it is risky because if you fuck something up so badly, you don't always get another crack at it. I think that's been proven to be true many times. Like, we see certain characters in certain films come out, they're not great, they fail. And automatically my first thought after watching something that I just know is a failure, I'm like, well, it's going to be like another 10 years before we ever revisit that. And that's a long time, to go without something. But that's kind of just the nature of Hollywood. And of course, them wanting to make sure that they're green lighting and producing movies that are going to be successful. They're not going to put and hedge their bets on something that's not going to prove to be successful. So it was risky, but it turned out to work out in their favor. But the creative team behind the movie was really, really important to get together. Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick were hired to write the script in January of 2010. And it's important to know Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick wrote all the Deadpool movies. They wrote the first one, the second one, and now they're also writing Deadpool and Wolverine, but they were hired all the way back in January of 2010. So they were trying to work on this movie pretty early. Ryan Reynolds, who worked closely with them, said that they were chosen because, quote, tonally, they got it. They just understood Deadpool right off the bat, end quote. By that June, director Robert Rodriguez had been asked to direct the film, and he confirmed this a month later, saying it had been sent a really good script and was considering taking on the project, but by that October, he was no longer interested in it. Robert Rodriguez, his name has come up a couple of times. How would that movie have been? I don't know if that's a a good movie or not, but he's an experienced director,
Yeah.
especially at that time. And ultimately, who they hired, Tim Miller, not an experienced director. It worked out, but
You're
Tim
right.
Miller had not made any movie before Deadpool. Hypothetical, of course, but what does a Robert Rodriguez Deadpool movie even look like?
I don't know. It's so interesting because he has the resume, low key, like, but also like I don't know. It might have made sense actually. Like I'm thinking about like a mix between like Spy Kids and like Machete, like or
Hmm.
like Sin City. Like I think he might have got it. He might have understood the assignment. I don't know if it would have been as good because maybe Tim. I don't know. Tim just kind of ate. You know what I'm saying? But I don't know. Maybe it would have been something. I don't know. Who knows?
It's interesting. He's a name that I'm like, oh, I could kind of see that because he also has a great pop culture Rolodex too. You know, he's
Yeah.
very much like Tarantino, and that has to be something that you associate with the Deadpool character. Deadpool has a endless list of pop culture references, and Robert Rodriguez, he's a student of the game. He knows pop culture, he knows
Hmm.
cinematic history, he has style. He definitely would have brought a different vision to the movie, but it would have been his own vision, and it would have been bloody and violent in all the same ways. He had done a lot of rated R stuff up until that point. I would have been interested in seeing that, but ultimately, fate turned out to be working in a different direction because in April of 2011, Tim Miller was hired after working on the visual effects for some of the X-Men movies. And so he had been in the Fox X-Men camp for a number of years. And also because he had done some work on some animated short films. These included the Academy Award winning film that was Go for Broke. It was called Go for Broke, excuse me. But he also worked on a DC Universe Online trailer, which had a lot of animation, a lot of CGI effects. It was, quote, epic and cinematic, and it was everything that Fox wanted their comic book movies to be. So something that he developed essentially for an online video game was in part
Hmm.
responsible for getting him the job, which is really interesting. But Tim Miller would ultimately make his directorial debut with the movie, and Ryan Reynolds ultimately closed the deal to help produce the film as well. Tim Miller, he wouldn't go on to direct any more Deadpool movies after this. They ultimately parted ways in the lead up and the pre-production to the second one. But what do you think he brought to this movie? Just entirely, from sort of watching it the first time, of course, revisiting it over
Hmm.
the years. I mean, as a first time director, this is kind of an outstanding first effort. I mean, it can't really get any more impressive than this, and to come out and direct at the time what was ultimately to be the highest R-rated grossing movie of all time at that point. And not only that, you also kind of introduce a new character to pop culture that becomes extremely popular with audiences around the world.
Man, the dude had been around. I think that really helps. His technical credits, like you said, he was just on so many different movies. He was on, Thor and Scott Pilgrim and stuff. Like he understood, I think, the superhero landscape from a technical perspective. And I think that's one of the things that he adds to the movie. Literally the first 20 minutes of the movie is a big action scene. You know what I'm saying? Is doing all kind of there's a lot of CGI and a lot of action and there's a lot going on in those first early minutes. But that's also the parts I think of Deadpool that he understood and brought to this movie too. Was like, of course he's funny, of course he's going to break the fourth wall. But Ryan Reynolds is going to do that stuff. He got that stuff. How are we going to make this look and feel like a Deadpool movie? And I think he was able to come in there and again use his experience to make us feel like we were in something different. But also, what's so interesting about it is the way it's colored. It still always reminds me of like color graded. It always reminds me of still like an Origins world, almost like an X-Men Wolverine Origins world. It's still dark. It's not the most bright movie. That first Deadpool, not the most bright movie either. So yeah, I just think he kind of understood the assignment. And was able to, I think, bring the physicality to Deadpool rather than just the other stuff. He was able to be like, yeah, you're going to do these funny things with your body. You're going to do these crazy things with your body. And these are the set pieces. So, yeah, I think that's what he brought to the table, man. I think he did a really good job of it.
Yeah, that technical prowess that he brought was incredibly important because this movie had a shoestring budget compared to other comic book movies. It was
Mm-hmm.
only budgeted at $58 million. Now, this is at a time where comic book movies are being budgeted and greenlit at 200, 220, 250, sometimes $300 million. But Fox didn't want to give all that money to Deadpool because, again, they were kind of gun shy on the whole prospect. And because he had such experience in the technical realm, he had worked on CGI, he had worked on practical and post production, all these different things. I think he had a true understanding of how to get a lot out of a little, how to make the most out of something,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to be resourceful, and necessity sort of breeds creativity and invention. And you needed a director who probably didn't have the experience of working with a $200 million budget because because he never had that experience, he never had to worry about not having that much money. He knew that he had to work within certain parameters, but I think that allowed him to be creative and infuse his experience and sort of his ingenuity. It's ultimately what the movie became to be. So it was actually quite, I think, a brilliant decision to pick somebody who had not really helmed a comic book tentpole movie, really a movie at all in any respect, to come on and do this film, especially just considering the constraints that they had at the time. But this movie did languish in development hell for quite a long time. Again, they hired screenwriters in 2010, but the movie didn't come out for another 6 years because of a lot of different reasons. Ryan Reynolds ultimately decided to go ahead and do the Green Lantern movie for DC, which was released in 2011. And that obviously turned out to be a pretty massive failure, a big comic book movie bomb. And ultimately, this disappointment tainted the Deadpool project. Fox executives were already concerned about making an R-rated movie. And after several meetings, the studio agreed that the film could not be reconfigured for a more traditional PG-13 rating. So I think they understood, like, this has to be rated R, but they were still very hesitant about greenlighting the movie. But they gave Tim Miller a low six-figure budget to produce some test footage. They needed a proof of concept. They needed something to just show, like, what is this movie going to look like and what is it going to be? So he created the footage using CGI at his animation company in 2012. Ryan Reynolds did some voice work on it. The footage didn't still convince Fox to greenlight the movie. They looked at it and said, still not ready to make this movie. It's still not happening. And after the successful May release of The Avengers in 2012, Reese and Wernick, the screenwriters, thought Deadpool might be approved as an already developed superhero film, and Fox was actually even more doubtful about the script. However, they began exploring ways to include Deadpool in an Avengers-esque team-up film. So Fox is like, let's just kind of do what we already did with Wolverine. Let's just put him in a team-up film. We're not going to learn anything here. We're not going to give him his own movie, but we saw what Marvel did with the Avengers. A team-up movie might work. Let's just figure out a way to work them in with some other superheroes. And at different times during development, James Cameron and David Fincher, two well-respected legendary directors, both friends of Tim Miller, they read the film script and they championed the project to Fox. So you had some very prominent directors saying, we got to make this movie. This is a great script. This could be really, really fun. James Cameron and David Fincher.
Cameron and David Fincher.
Those are ridiculous names to have on your side.
Who would have thought? Not me.
But ultimately, they still were not convinced. It still did not work for Fox. They still were not ready to greenlight this movie. It wasn't until July of 2014, 10 years ago almost to the day, that the test footage that Tim Miller created leaked online. And once it leaked online, it was met with an overwhelmingly enthusiastic response. If you've never seen the test footage, it's really cool to go back and check out because it's literally the entire car chase sequence in the beginning of the movie. It's shot for shot the same exact stuff. The dialogue's a little bit different in the final version of the movie, but it's basically a proof of concept for that first big action set piece. And ultimately, once fans saw it and they said, wait a second, this is what we want. This is the Deadpool movie that we've been yearning for. Finally, Fox gave in and agreed to greenlight the Deadpool movie. And they ultimately gave it a release date of February 12th, 2016. Ryan Reynolds would later attribute Fox's greenlighting on the film entirely to the leak. He, Tim Miller, and the writers previously discussed leaking the footage themselves. And Ryan Reynolds initially thought that Tim Miller was the one responsible. He blames him. He says, you fucking leaked that footage, didn't you? But he also later believed that the leak came from somebody, maybe even at Fox, working with inside the studio. And in exchange for being able to make the film the way that they wanted to, Fox gave the crew a much smaller budget than is typical for superhero films, but they did give the green light. I mean, man, what a crazy story. What a crazy, crazy development for the development of this movie. The fact that they just were not ready to make this. They didn't want to go ahead and greenlight it, but it was ultimately this enthusiastic fan response, this worldwide global response of people that said, wait, this is great. We want to see more of this. We want to see a long 2-hour version of this. What do you make of that? Just considering how powerful fans really can be in this whole development of things. And can you even think of any other examples of fan outcry, fan reaction that have created sort of a groundswell, a movement of people to actually get something greenlit, especially on this large of a scale?
You say that, and we're talking about Tim Miller, who also produced the Sonic movies, and we'll never forget the outcry when
Man.
everybody first seen that Sonic character.
Whew.
So yeah, also partially I think Sonic's success, Tim Miller also is helping over there, with some of that stuff. But man, fan outcry, you can never tell me the power's not in the people, man. You can never tell me that. I actually remember that test footage dropping and being like, wait, test footage, are we sure this ain't what's going on here? And I remember so many people, I think, being excited that this was a possibility. But I think it is hard sometimes for studios to listen to that. Still, like we'll people shout on the internet all the time. There's always outcries on the internet, you know what I'm saying? But it doesn't always work. But this is one of those moments. I think enough had happened. Everything you just said. If James Cameron's championing it and David Fincher's championing it, and then they see the test footage and they're still like, we don't know. It took the people. That was the last thing to push over the finish line for them to be like, okay, if both worlds are colliding like this, we might have to do this thing. So yeah, this was definitely one of the earlier times I think I had seen this happen, because again, this is the age of the internet now. We in 2016, 2015, you know what I'm saying? We're in different territory where people I think can be more vocal, and companies are looking on Twitter, in social media. But yeah, this was I think a good moment in just comic book history. The fact that they were able, the people were able to voice their opinion and get something made, or at least get it over the finish line of it being made. So yeah, that, and then I always think about Sonic. I can't not think about Sonic. They literally got bullied into changing the whole character. So yeah, I love that.
It turns out that the people themselves who will be purchasing tickets to the movie ultimately have the influence and the power. What a novel concept, but it makes all the sense in the world that they kind of needed that extra final push from the people themselves. You need to hear from the audience that is going to likely try to show up or not show up for this movie to tell you, like, yeah, we'll go see this movie. Yeah, make it. Please, I'll be there on opening day. But this was definitely an inside job. I don't know if it was on the part of Fox or on the part of Tim Miller.
Either or. Yeah.
Somebody did this shit on purpose, because it's no coincidence that it happened during Comic-Con weekend in July of 2014, when you have the most amount of attention and eyeballs on this type of material to begin with. Like, this is definitely not an accident. Somebody was up to some other shit, but smartfully and rightfully so. I mean, if this hadn't happened, Fox would probably still be sitting on this script and still would have never made this Deadpool movie. And so I'm thankful for it. But this was this is really one of the first times that a entire movie got commissioned based off of something like this. I mean, there have been versions of movies that have had this type of support.
Yep.
Obviously, the Snyder Cut over the past couple of years, the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, that was like a groundswell of fan support, but pre-internet, pre-social media. But this is literally an entire movie. We're not talking about the director's cut. We're not talking about the home video version. They weren't even going to make the movie. So they literally had the people say, like, fucking do this. And you'll get all the money in the world if you do it. And of course, they rightfully did. And of course, it paid dividends for them. But moving on to the story aspects, the writing of the film and the screenplay, the writers initially did not want this film to be an origin story, but Ryan Reynolds strongly disagreed with that notion. They ultimately settled on a modern Deadpool story, as well as the origin story connected by Deadpool's narration and fourth wall breaking. This ultimately helped to balance the darker origin story with the cartoon-like Deadpool scenes that would be taking place in the more modern day. It also allowed the opening fight sequence to be extended through the first half of the film, which the origin story is told throughout, saving money on additional fight scenes. And the fight sequence was ultimately labeled the 12 Bullets fight, which reimagines the original test footage, as I mentioned earlier. And once the origin story would be told in the film, Deadpool uses a, quote, fast forward button to return to the audience to the present day. I think that this is just an interesting thing, right? Because by 2016, we had been probably origin story to death in comic book movies. We had seen a lot of them. We saw multiple iterations of Batman. We saw Spider-Man. The X-Men had somewhat of an origin-like feel. First Class had come out at this point. It had just been done time and time again, and I think audiences were once again yearning for something new. And this movie doesn't abandon the concept of an origin story, but they do something different. They tell the film in a non-linear fashion. It's told out of order. We start off with Deadpool as Deadpool, and they get right into the action. As you said, like the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of the movie is a big, giant action set piece, and then we go back in time to see what happened with Wade Wilson and ultimately how he became the Merc with the Mouth, essentially. What do you think about that choice and just the fact that the film is even, you know, sort of irreverent in how it's constructed. It's done so in somewhat of a non-traditional way, especially compared to other comic book movies that had come out at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, hey, if you're gonna do origin story, what are we gonna do different? How are we gonna capture audiences? I think in a different way. And shout out to Ryan Reynolds for also just I think going to bat for the origin story of Deadpool is not a character that's been around that much. You know what I'm saying? It's like I think now we are tired of the Spider-Man, the Batman. We know their origin stories. A lot of people have no idea what Deadpool went through, and so like I'm really happy that they decided to go ahead and do Deadpool's origin story for sure. But yeah, they had to switch it up, man, and give us, I think, a different tactic to not make it feel like, oh, here goes another origin story. Instead, they kind of weave it out, like like you just you said, man. It's like there's a little bit of action. Here's a little bit of Wade Wilson, not Deadpool. You know what I'm saying? There's a little bit of action. Here's a little bit of Wade Wilson, and I think they tell that story just so effectively. They're able to do it to where it makes sense. But then by the time you do catch up to the story, because it's funny, the second one also follows the same formula of like, how did I get here? Kind of type thing. It's like, oh, how did we get here? Second one also follows the same formula, but it works for this character because he is so fourth wall breaking too. It's like, the story don't got to be linear because I'm literally can talk to you at any point in time, look you in your eyes in the movie theater and be like, here's a plot point that you know about, or here's a joke to get you up to speed. So I think it just works so well for the character that they went that direction, man. It just made too much sense, I think, almost not to do, and I'm very glad they did it.
It matches his chaos, his unpredictability, his crazy. Like, you never really know what direction Deadpool is going to go in. So smartly, I think, and rightfully, they made the choice to do that same thing with the structure of the movie. Like, let's do it differently. Let's do something totally different. And let's really grab the audience and grab their attention off bat with something like huge and epic in a way that's going to be super memorable. You'll never forget the opening of the film, and then we can ease them into, as they said, some of the darker elements of the story, because it does get a little dark when you see like everything that he goes through and the fact that it becomes somewhat of a revenge story too. But if you just introduce mass audiences who aren't familiar with Deadpool and you see him take off the mask for the first time, you're like, what the fuck is wrong with his face? Like, what happened to this guy? And we never explore that. That's a big missed opportunity. So you have to go through that whole saga of his mutant abilities, his aerial abilities, his marksman abilities, all the stuff that makes him a mercenary and, you know, a trained assassin essentially, and also just like where he gets his comedy from, which is oftentimes borrowed from, you know, places of pain, you know, places where he's experienced a lot of heartbreak in his life and a lot of painful situations that have come from his past. So it was a good decision. It was really smart. But let's talk about that 12 bullets fight and the opening set piece. I mean, can you remember how you felt when you first saw that? When you I'm assuming you saw this in the movies. I mean, it was 2016.
Oh yeah,
so
I definitely did. Yeah.
What was it like those first 20 minutes when you see the opening credits and already they're doing weird stuff? They're saying like it's produced by some douchebag. Like in the opening credits of the movie, it's the slow motion 3D like sequence, and then we get the whole interaction with him and Dopender, which is really funny, all the way through to the action where he has to figure out a way to kill like 20 different guys with only 12 bullets left. I mean, it does so much to introduce you to the character and set up the tone for the film. Can you remember just like how you felt seeing this all unfold for the first time when the movie came out?
Yeah, man, my anticipation for this film was already so high. I mean, we already talked about the test footage and the talks about the movie. This also comes out around my birthday. It comes out the 12th. My birthday's the 13th. And it was like they were playing on this whole Valentine's Day thing. I was just excited to go see this just in general. And so going in there, I was like, oh, shoot, what are they going to do? It's Deadpool. I know this character so much better than I did a couple years before. And it's like, all right, what's going to happen here? And I think that set piece, at the time, it was everything. I ain't gonna lie to you because I think we had been so accustomed at that point. Again, MCU heroes they're so nice. They're such nice people, and they're so heroic, and you know, and we don't get to see blood, and we don't get to see any of those things really. It took us a while, I think, to get to the point that we're about to reach. You know what I'm saying? I think we are about to go into a different territory, and we have hit some new highs when it comes to, I guess, violence and I think just being kind of raunchy within superhero films. But here was like it's like eye opening almost. Like, whoa, is this what this could be? You know what I mean? Like there was so much potential that was being used in this movie that I think as I was watching the 12 bullet scene, I think I had never seen like the way genres were merging together, because there were a lot of movies coming. It wasn't just a superhero film in that, because Deadpool, of course, he uses swords, but the stuff he's doing with the gun did feel like, I don't know, other gun crazy movie, Shooter and Wanted, and you know what I mean. It's like other things that was merging, I think, into the film. It was like, whoa, this is really cool. So yeah, I think I was really happy, I think, to see again how what R-rated superhero dumb could be, and how Deadpool, and how funny that these movies also could be, because we also, of course, MCU had also been funny up until that point, but that's like Deadpool's thing. You know what I'm saying? If you open a comic right now, you're not going to be like, "Hi, Captain America, you're so funny." You're not going to do that, because it's not how the character's written. That's who Deadpool is. So it was constant throwing out all of these funny things with the violence that I don't know. And again, in the early moments, it was just crazy, and I didn't understand that this was the heights of what Deadpool could reach. So I just remember being like very, very happy in those early moments of the film, and being like, yeah, I'm here. Like, I can't wait to watch the rest of the movie, to be honest, because that was the beginning. I can't wait to see the rest.
It's also rare to have a film completely nail the character within the opening seconds. Like, you just automatically know from the first few frames, oh my God, they got it. They nailed it
got it.
already. And you just know that you're in really, really good hands, and you know you're going to go on an incredible ride. And I remember seeing it opening Thursday night previews. Movie theater was packed. It was Valentine's Day weekend, as you said. They were certainly taking advantage of that weekend, and the fact that, you know, a lot of people were going to go out on dates, and you know, sitting in that theater with a audience of people that I think were just wanting something different that had not been experienced within the genre up until that point. You can just tell people were eager for something that felt new, and the marketing, you know, which we'll get to, it all signaled that it would be different, and feel completely fresh than all the other films that we were getting from Marvel Studios and even DC at that time. But it wasn't until you sat down and you just saw those opening scenes and the opening action set piece where you just knew, like, oh my God, we're in totally new territory. It's hard to believe that we weren't really getting R-rated comic book movies really before this, except like Blade and Watchmen.
Yep.
Those were kind of the two big examples. That was all. And it's like, well, this is what we've been missing out on. We could have been doing like more mature stuff this entire time, and it can be funny, it can be romantic, it can be irreverent, it can be shocking and surprising. All of those things, man, it just merged into such a just a wonderful treat. And again, it was something that you felt from the opening seconds, and how important it was. And then you see the action, which I think is important also to mention too, because action in comic book movies had been continuing to evolve and develop, but the action in this movie was already so different than everything else too, because it was not only violent, but it was a lot of finesse to the character, because he is really acrobatic and athletic. That's not something we really saw. Like, you kind of saw it a little bit with Captain America and what they were doing with Steve Rogers in the MCU. Spider-Man has some finesse, of course, but there's a lot of the web swinging stuff. We weren't really getting a ton of hand-to-hand combat with Spider-Man, but now hand-to-hand combat, gunplay, swordplay, there's all sorts of stuff Deadpool can do that we had just not really seen. So that also added on top of just the excitement of what those first few moments really developed. Moving on here, though, Tim Miller, he wanted to include, quote, more superhero stuff instead of just Deadpool and a lot of guns in the movie. And ultimately, the character Negasonic Teenage Warhead was added as a trainee X-Men who would be mentored by Colossus in the movie. And she was chosen for her name, pretty much only her name, because they had a list of comic book characters that were available to them from Fox. And they said, oh, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, that's an incredible name. Let's include her in the movie. And at one point, Cable was set to appear in the film, but was eventually pushed to what will be a potential sequel. As we know, he did get introduced in that film, played by Josh Brolin. But talk about Colossus and Negasonic Teenage Warhead in this movie, because they're also like really important, because Deadpool carries a lot of the film. Of course, it's all resting on Ryan Reynolds' shoulder, but he needs somebody to play off of outside of just having a villain. And we do get two X-Men, you know, in the movie. They don't have access to necessarily the Hugh Jackmans of the world, the Patrick Stewarts of the world, but they figured out a way to bring in these other two mutants to have Deadpool play off of. What do they mean to you in the context of, you know, sort of their relationship with Wade in the film, but also just like, I guess, kind of the importance that they play in terms of how different they are compared to the Deadpool character?
I love the idea of Colossus being in this movie, because knowing Colossus as a character and knowing Deadpool, it's so obvious that Deadpool would ruin Colossus's life the same way he does in this movie. Like, it's like exactly what would happen. Colossus really is like a really good dude, hella Russian, you know what I'm saying? And that's exactly what Deadpool isn't. And so I think in the movie, he does such a good job of again trying to be this moral compass for him. But it never works out because Deadpool's just not that guy. But I love the attempt. Like I think that does happen also throughout X-Men comics. Everybody's like, just come be an X-Men. Of course he does. He's an X-Men in and out of the comics as well sometimes. But like it's just really funny because yeah, Deadpool's like, dude, you you could be an X-Men, but you don't want to be. Like you just kind of you play by your own rules. You're definitely an anti-hero. And that's not who the X-Men are. And so yeah, I love them being able, I think, to play off Colossus for that idea, that big grand idea of who the X-Men are. Especially Colossus is a well-known character that we hadn't seen a lot up until that point. We'd seen Colossus for like 3 seconds in The Last Stand, you know, or maybe it was 2 even, X2 even. It was just like we haven't seen him that much, but when you see him pop up, you're like, oh yeah, that's Colossus. Everybody knows Colossus. Bring him in here. And so I was glad to see that Colossus even just got more time for people to be like, oh, that's who that character is. That's how he talks. And they got him pretty well. That felt like a really good Colossus. And then Negasonic Teenage Warhead. The name speaks for itself, man. It's too good of a name. Like it's so perfect. But there's something about, again, this year, this 2016 thing that they do so well with Negasonic Teenage Warhead being just a meta teenager. She probably knows everything that's happening, but also she's a teenager, so she hates everything around her and she doesn't want to be there. But it's funny that she's an X-Men and the mansion is probably full of people just like Negasonic Teenage Warhead, of somebody that would exist at that time. But yeah, they made a ton of sense for her to come in and also kind of just be a douchebag to Deadpool in a different way, because I think she was just on a different spectrum of like, I'm just here because I have to be here. I hate you, Wade. Go away kind of type feeling, but it is what it is. But I think they did a good job of both of those characters.
And what they do with introducing and pairing Wade with a relatively known mutant and a pretty much unknown mutant, it adds more material to the movie because Wade will explicitly say, like, so y'all can't afford the heavy hitters? Like, why don't I get the big names in my movie? Where's Storm? Where's Professor X? Where are all of these really well-known celebrity mutants? You give me the C team, you know, in this film. And I think that's also just like a funny thing, a very meta concept that of course he would have something to say about, but also just, you know, enjoying Colossus in this movie was also, it was a treat as well because they could really nail the design in a way that they just didn't do in those initial appearances. He looked really faithful to what we saw in the comic book, so it was just another opportunity to revisit what he looked like. And so great choice overall for, you know, for just like having them pair and be the foils for Deadpool on a moral standpoint, but also just on a tonal standpoint too, because they're completely different obviously than how he would be. But also Tim Miller was very adamant about just like the type of material that would be in the movie. He said that he felt it was okay that audience members might not understand all of the film's jokes and references, but he wanted to avoid anything targeted specifically at comic book fans. He was not in favor of any jokes that the audience would, quote, need to look up on the internet after the movie ends, end quote. This is a comedy movie at the end of the day, before it's anything else. I think before it's a superhero movie, before it's a romance movie, before it's a fantasy or sci-fi movie, this is a comedy. And comedy, even at this time, was evolving and changing. We weren't really getting traditional comedies anymore. And Deadpool might, in large part, be responsible for that. I mean, of course, Marvel Studios and the MCU were starting to really, I think, affect the comedy genre because they had put so much comedy in their movies, obviously with Robert Downey Jr. and everything that he achieved with Jon Favreau. And the industry as a whole, as things were starting to shift with streaming and comedies on a mid-budget level weren't really being made for theaters all that much anymore. Some of them were still being made, but we were definitely on a downtrend. And then Deadpool comes in and says, like, well, we can just do a superhero movie, but make it a comedy. And I think now we're in an era where most movies that would be in existence within another genre, that's not really enough for studios. Like, you have to be this plus this. You have to be a drama plus a time travel movie. You have to be a comedy plus a superhero movie, anything of that nature. Right. And I wonder how responsible Deadpool might be for that transition and that change, because I don't know, comedy kind of got ruined after this. Not ruined in a negative sense, but ruined in a sense where they're just not being made to the degree of what we saw in like the 2000s or even the 90s. What do you think about that? Just the fact that comedy obviously is, you know, really the number one aspect of this movie. And it's great. And it's ultimately, you know, one of the best parts of it. It's a really funny movie, but also how it possibly changed the industry and how it sort of changed the way that I think studio executives wanted to move forward in terms of the movies that they made.
Yeah, in terms of Deadpool, it makes nothing but a ton of sense. The character is commonly there for comedic relief. You know, you're not reading an Avengers comic and be like, "Whoop, I can't wait till Deadpool shows up and and saves the day." That's not what the character, was there for. He's literally there to be funny, be self-aware. I think is like one of the best things about Deadpool, being able to talk about, I think, your own material in of course, a funny, but it's kind of a healthy way too. Of like, ooh. Did you know this thing existed? Why did we do that back then? What is this thing? It almost keeps some of the writers on their toes, I think, in the comics that he's a part of. And I think I think for this movie, being comedy first made a ton of sense. Now, it potentially changing that landscape, like you said, things becoming hybrid. You have to be comedy and something else, comedy and another thing. Ooh, I, it it's just unfortunate because I think it's annoying because Hollywood, they're people of numbers, man, and they like when things do well. They take the formula and they run with it. They're like, well, that thing did too good. Let's go make 25 more, and that's just how it is in the industry, unfortunately. And of course, I don't like that. I wish we could be a little better at it, have a little more nuance about the stories we tell, be a little more open to just, here's a comedy movie. It doesn't have to have anything else, guys. It's just a comedy. It's okay. Let's do just a comedy movie. But I couldn't have seen this movie going any other direction. So I think it just can be, I think, a little sad of the influence sometimes that something has. We even talked about it recently of like, Barbenheimer, did we create a whole new can of worms with that whole phenomenon? You know what I'm saying? Are people gonna start coming out of the gate like doing things like that? And I think Deadpool is kind of in that same vein where we can kind of see, like you said, after this time, comedy starts to shift a little bit, and maybe it wasn't necessarily for the better.
I mean, oftentimes the things that we love the most, the things that we revere, the things that we call influential, they have very negative effects as well. Nothing is just
Hmm.
wholly great in its existence. I mean, I think in a lot of respects, The Dark Knight ruined the movie industry. Although I think that that's
Did
one of the greatest films ever made, it's quite possibly my favorite movie ever made, but
my
it
favorite?
ruined
Yeah.
a lot of stuff, and I won't dive into that whole diatribe of what that is. That's a separate podcast, but I think it's similar to Deadpool because
Hmm.
before this, there were tons of raunchy R-rated comedies. That wasn't a unique concept. I mean, Seth
Right.
Rogen and Judd Apatow, like what they were producing and
They
putting
were
out at the
running.
time, like
They were
it
running it.
was a it
Yep.
was a run that was pretty unprecedented. We hadn't seen anything really like that since the 80s, almost, when you had people like Bill Murray and Eddie Murphy and Dan
Hmm.
Aykroyd, like these comedians, really putting out a lot of funny films. And Adam Sandler had a great run in the 90s, Jim Carrey, but they weren't doing like the
Hmm.
most raunchy stuff. That
Hmm.
2000s run, I think, introduced like a whole new generation of comedians and talent, but really kind of took comedy to just a different level where it's like everything is fair game. Nothing is off limits. We're just going to take it balls to the wall, comedy, really in your face, just wild stuff. And Deadpool as a superhero film also, and as a genre that had become the dominant form of entertainment in Hollywood. I mean, it was swallowing up a lot of stuff. It was just like
Hmm.
overtaking really any genre that we were, quite possibly enjoying at that time. And for a lot of people, they don't necessarily notice those things or think about it, but I think it certainly changed the tide in a pretty drastic way where it was already set in motion before this, again, as I mentioned, with like Marvel Studios making a lot of their superhero films more comedic by nature. But this just saying like we're just going to go all the way with it. I think at this point there's kind of really no turning back, and it's no coincidence
Yeah.
that like post 2016, post mid 2015s, like we or post mid 2010s, I should say, we don't start to see those raunchy R-rated comedies come out in theaters as often as
Hmm.
we used to. Even still to this day, we don't see those movies being made to that degree. But also the fourth wall breaking nature is another important aspect to sort of digest, because at this point, superhero films were on a run. I mean, we're 8 years into the MCU. That's
Sheesh.
a pretty hefty run even up until this point without the inclusion of Infinity War and Endgame. But 8 years into their dominance, DC's also making movies. Sony's making
Hmm.
Spider-Man movies. Fox is making X-Men movies. Comic book movies are the thing. They are the number one type of film that people go to see. They're making the most money. And it's also interesting that Deadpool comes out at a time to where we can provide commentary on that success.
Hmm.
Does this movie work in any other era? Does this movie work in the early 2000s? Like, let's just take the movie the exact way that it is. Let's say that they somehow are able to knock it out of the park in 2002. Does it work the same? Because, you know, at that time, we had some successful examples like Spider-Man and X-Men, but it wasn't the dominant form of entertainment. Can this movie really work in any other era outside of the year that it came out in?
I don't think so. Not era wise, right? I think you could push the movie up a couple years, push it back a couple years, it still works. But nah, it doesn't work back then because you need comic book content. Deadpool exists because comic books exist, and Deadpool the movie exists because comic book movies exist, and it's important, I think, for it to happen in that way and in that order. It doesn't work. Say we only had Blade and Deadpool comes out. What is he talking about? There's no
just Blade. The entire movie, he's just fucking dumping on Blade,
just going in on Blade. It literally just it doesn't work, man. You have to have, I think, all of that other material in order for Deadpool to make sense. That's the essence of the character, and yeah, man. So I can't see it. I don't think there's no way that it. I think it's literally perfect timing, and also partially what makes the movie special is the timing.
Yeah, I think you still have a plethora of pop culture things that you can reference in the movie that would still work and be fine. Like,
yeah,
all of the material goes well outside of just the comic book realm, certainly. And I think that helps and makes the film even more brilliant than it is. But it does benefit from having an industry that is thriving and at the forefront of entertainment, to commentate and to provide commentary on that stuff, because it just hits different at that point, because likely, in all likelihood, the audience has also seen a lot of these other films. They know the reference points, they know the stuff that he's poking fun at, and so that just makes it a more enjoyable experience. But this becomes really influential. I mean, think about the marketing of a movie with like the Suicide Squad, which comes out later that year, which the movie doesn't turn out to be that way, but the way that they market it, it's to be this more irreverent, wild, goofy sort of fun ride. Or other projects that we would see in the successive years come out, Peacemaker and The Boys that we're talking about right now. Like, do these things even work in the context without having a Deadpool exist? Because like now, having comic book films and television shows be referential, be irreverent, be unserious, that's very normal. I think we're kind of used to it now, and we still enjoy it, but it's certainly not to the same degree in which, you know, Deadpool was kind of the first one out of the gate to really do it on a large scale. Do those properties even get the latitude to be in existence and to have this playground to really play in if we don't see a movie like Deadpool come along and sort of usher in, I think, just the ways in which that can be palpable for large audiences?
Yeah, you know, I think some of that stuff would exist, but maybe not on the playing field or the pedestal that it's on now, right? Like, I think it makes sense that let's say The Boys, the comic, was still being written, the TV show still comes out. Without Deadpool, do as many people watch it? I don't think as many people watch it. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it took Deadpool to go, ooh, this is like ridiculous in the best ways. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is so this is commentary in the ways in which we can both make fun of it and make it important at the same time. And like you said, maybe without Deadpool, a lot of those things don't happen. The Boys doesn't happen. Some of these other properties and projects don't happen, I think, to that degree. Yeah, I don't think so. I think Deadpool made everyone go, ooh, I want to watch that now, because I've seen that before and I've enjoyed that. Let me watch that. And I think, yeah, it probably would have helped numbers. I can imagine The Boys came out like the same year. I think it's still a good show, but I don't think it's the same show without something like Deadpool, you know, coming on down the line and having all that influence.
It's definitely not the same show, and I'm purely speculating here, but I brought up Seth Rogen for a reason earlier, because there might have been a moment when Deadpool comes out in 2016, and Seth Rogen, very smart, very in tune person with just the changing nature of the industry. He probably realized where comedies were heading and things were changing and altering. Streaming is also becoming a big thing. Marvel is dominating. How can I take my brand of comedy, what I'm good at, and figure out a way to pair that with things that I also love from a geek perspective, from a nerd perspective? Because he is that at the end of the day as well. Him and Evan Goldberg, they've always been into this stuff. And so that's how you stumble upon something like The Boys and Invincible. Again, I'm making it up, but I don't know. It's probably not a coincidence that we ultimately get the development of those shows after Deadpool comes out from the very creators, which probably got usurped by the comedy brilliance, the comedic brilliance of a Deadpool movie existing. I mean, in all actuality, I think a lot of these things, they kind of speak to each other in some direct and indirect ways, So I think it probably does get made at some point because they're going to try to scrape the bottom of the barrel. All of these companies are going to try to find something to adapt. They want their own toys in this whole big sandbox that people are playing with. But the comedy of Deadpool, I think, certainly gave everybody permission to say, yeah, just go, just do it, just run with it, and people will probably accept it as if it's good. Let's talk about the suit as well. So an immediate focus during the pre-production of the film was Deadpool's suit. Russ Schinkel and Film Illusions were hired to create the costume. Schinkel noted that the, quote, comic book art is fairly over the top in terms of physique, and he tried to balance that with reality. And so Ryan Reynolds didn't want to wear a muscle suit underneath the costume, and Tim Miller, he felt that the suit needed a more slimmer, quintessential Deadpool look. And Tim Miller and Ryan Reynolds, they wept when they saw the completed costume. They shed real tears, I guess, because they were so happy at the final product. And Ryan Reynolds explained, quote, "We fought like hell to make this the most faithful comic book to movie adaptation fans have ever seen. That's hard to accomplish and a feat, but we're just so happy with how this came out," end quote. How important is that to this movie as well? I mean, we talk about faithfulness, and in particular with this XMen franchise, they weren't being as faithful as they probably could have. And we have noted that many times throughout this podcast series, but this was like one of the first times, I think, within this franchise in particular, where they're like, no, just take the design from the comics and translate it. Make it obviously adaptable and make it feasible in real life, but don't change what's not broke, and make it as faithful as it could possibly be.
Yeah, this is a character. There's no need to change what he wears, because everything, again, his influence, the influence of the character, he has to be there. It literally looks like Spider-Man, Deathstroke. You know what I'm saying? Like, he has to fit that mold also, I think, in order for him to make sense. And again, that's that self-awareness kind of piece as well. It's like, no, don't mess up anything, don't change the suit. We need this thing to look like Deadpool. People need to know, oh, that's Deadpool. And kind of, I think, a little different from a lot of our other heroes, Deadpool wears his suit all the time. He's not like Spider-Man, where you're going to see Peter Parker not wearing the suit for a decent amount of the movie. He's not like the X-Men, where you see them in the X-Mansion all dressed down for a decent amount of time. Like, Deadpool wears the shit out of that suit. The suit is him. A lot of superheroes aren't like that. You're going to see them outside of the suit a lot of the time. Not Deadpool. You open a comic right now, a Deadpool comic, I guarantee you're not going to see his face, which is interesting that they did go that way. Like, in the movie, like, you do see his face, of course, you know what I mean? That's still a whole part of him in the film, but you don't see Deadpool's face. That was like kind of like the whole thing. And so I'm definitely glad they went that direction. I'm glad they got it right. It looks fantastic. And even more important, something I think they got right in general, the eyes like make the suit completely. Like, when you watch these movies, I'm saying, you look at those eyes, you're like, yep, that's where they got it. Like, that's like the small cherry on top of the whole suit. Is like, whoa, those eyes look great. And so yeah, I'm just happy they got it right.
The suit's design is truly the unsung hero of all of this. It cannot be overstated how difficult it is for an actor to communicate so many different emotions underneath a mask, in which you can't tell how they're emoting underneath that. And Ryan Reynolds he's truly brilliant at doing this, because everything he has to do with his eyes, his mannerisms, his tone and tonality, his body language, his inflections, all of that adds to the character, because, as you said, he does wear the suit like 85% of the time. And so everything has to be communicated and come across clearly to audiences in terms of what emotions he's trying to get across. And the fact that Ryan Reynolds and the suit design and just like how it all meshes together creates this perfect formula and this perfect thing that comes out on the other side of it. It's a really difficult thing to do. I mean, it's just so important, because we hadn't really seen anything like this executed. I mean, those eyes and seeing how they were utilized in the movie, that was kind of the first time that they had ever tried something like that, to where the eyes are emoting. Any other costume we saw up until this point, that wasn't a thing. You know, Iron Man's eyes aren't moving. Batman's eyes, like, we just saw his regular eyes. And Spider-Man, it was just a flat emotionless mask underneath,
Hmm.
and ultimately, like, to see those eyes be executed in the way that they are, adding that on top of just all the other body language and all the other physical stuff that Ryan Reynolds is doing. I mean, he's really, again, a student of the game. This is stuff that
Yeah.
Buster Keaton was doing, in the early
Hmm.
1900s at the beginning of film, when it was just all silent films and you have nothing but body language to really kind of communicate, like, what is this even about? What type of comedy are we doing? He's doing a lot of that same stuff here. So it's really, really brilliant at how they, sort of displayed this and how they brought it to life. It definitely, I think, changed the game in ways that we often don't speak about as much as we probably should. But visual effects wise, this is also like a heavy visual effects movie, which I don't think a lot of people would assume just based off of the budget. But there's a lot of visual effects in this movie that they had to create. A lot of different studios and visual effects houses worked on it. Tim Miller worked with the visual effects supervisor, Jonathan Rothbard, to design and complete the film's 1,500 effect shots, 700 more than they originally planned, and 800 of those
Mm.
shots were completed in the last 4 weeks of production, which is just insane. That's insanity to me. I just don't know how that they did that. They had to create a freeway environment for the 12 Bullets fight in the beginning of the movie. That was not a real freeway. That's not a real city. They had to completely create that because it just wasn't feasible to shoot a big action set piece like that on a real freeway. But they did use backdrops based on Detroit and Chicago and Vancouver. But they did use real vehicles in the sequence as well. They also, went through a visual effects house to create that opening title sequence. And all the vendors that they worked with collaborated on the final battle sequence, which takes place at the records of a helicarrier. But they wanted to make sure that the third act didn't feel similar to what we saw in the Avengers, because the Avengers does have a
Hmm.
helicarrier sequence with the Shield
Hmm.
helicarrier. So they had to do things differently to make it feel distinctive and unique in its own right. I didn't even think about this first seeing the movie. It wasn't until just watching it and rewatching it over the years where it's like, wait, this is like a very heavy visual effects movie, because not only
Oh yeah.
do you have these big set pieces, but the costume has some CGI applied to it at certain moments.
Hmm.
And also, just like Deadpool as a hero or an anti-hero, the fact that he can regenerate and heal
Yep.
himself, and all these weird things that he has to do with his body. He's losing limbs and they grow back. There's
Hmm.
holes from bullets that grow back. Like, there's all these intricate things. Talk about that aspect of the film as well, because again, that's like a very physical thing that we just didn't really see in comic book movies before this, where you're seeing like just the minutia of these small things. And I think a large part of that is due to the fact that he is a mutant and he does have these regenerative abilities. But talk about that as a big major component to the movie.
Yeah, we were talking about Tim Miller and what he brought to the film, that physicality, and I think understanding the character was so important. And all these action scenes, he's doing so many crazy things that Ryan Reynolds can't do, like contorting his body certain ways, CGI, or like him when he's like trying to hit Colossus and breaking his arms. You know what I'm saying? That stuff. Some of the stuff is probably a little practical, right? I'm sure they did some of that stuff, but there's CGI in there. There's a lot of CGI happening in those shots. And I think he is a character that also another reason I think it couldn't be made in early, because I don't know if this character would have made sense without CGI. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot to him that is so in a lot of ways magical, that does fit the comic book realm in the way he operates. And that is a lot of those things. Even see the way bullets pierce through people, there's CGI in that. Like, you got to be able to make a lot of that stuff believable, especially the ways people the way he's shooting through heads and the way it looks. It's so graphic. But again, that you have to be able to convey that, I think, in a good way. But yeah, it is such a particular movie because there's so many elements to it. Into Deadpool, that's like the visual effects. I remember being like, yeah, it has to be good. Like, they don't kind of really have a choice. Even though he is using swords and bullets. This is Deadpool. He's not using them like anybody else uses these things. And so yeah, it was very important to the movie. And then of course you get the villains and Sonic Teenage Warhead, the way she looks. Colossus is completely CGI for the most part. So like, they had to be meticulous in everything they were doing. But unfortunately, I'm sad it came down to however many weeks, 4 weeks for 800 shots. That's insane. But I'm glad it turned out the way it turned out, though. It looks good for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, this in addition to being a comedy, which we spoke a lot about, it's also a very gritty, down to earth, grounded action movie too. But it is different because he is a mutant, and this is a very hyper violent, cartoonishly violent at times type of film in which many of these things are just completely impractical. Like, we can't just go for this being a Sylvester Stallone action movie or a Jackie Chan
Mm-hmm.
action movie where pretty much like they're doing 95% of that stuff practically. Like, there is no
Practical.
CGI.
Mm-hmm.
They're just doing
Right.
stunts and fucking risking their lives. But here, he's literally chopping his arm off. He's knifing his arm off. Like, that
Yep.
is gross, disgusting stuff that we have to figure out a creative way to go about doing, make it look as real as
Yeah.
possible. But the slow-mo stuff is also very important because of all of those
Mm-hmm.
aerial acrobatic type of moves that he's doing that we hadn't really seen before. I think just the usage and the implementation of CGI here is brilliant. It's the ways that I want to see it, where it's enhancing the final product. It's not noticeable. It's not a thing that's completely replacing something, unless it's like
Mm-hmm.
absolutely necessary. It's just enhancing the storytelling and the tone of what the character is supposed to be. We're not seeing beams come out of the sky. We're not seeing big spaceships loom over the earth. We're not seeing 1,000 army Chitauri invade New York City. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
just moments and these smaller things to enhance ultimately, I guess, the cartoonish violence that Deadpool is going to be responsible for. And it's mostly used, I think, in really, really great ways throughout the movie that just enhance it. And it looks good too. Like, it's aged, I think, really beautifully. All of the CGI
Yeah.
here still looks very,
Mm-hmm.
very well, even to this day. We should talk about the marketing for this movie, which I think, for my money, this has to be considered one of the greatest marketing campaigns mounted for a big budget movie, really in history, probably, because they
Yes.
truly created some watershed moments that I think
Yes.
paved the way for how a lot of movies try to market themselves today. But an extensive marketing campaign was carried out before the film's release. Ryan Reynolds worked closely with the Fox marketing team to take advantage of the internet and social media due to the film's lower budget. So, just again, out of necessity, they had to do things differently because they didn't have a $200 million marketing budget. They had very little money, and so they wanted to go in non-traditional routes. And so focus was put on the lead character and his signature humor and violence rather than just solely on the film, with Reynolds appearing in character as Deadpool for several different promotions. Ryan Reynolds even went as far as to keep one of the costumes for himself, and he appeared in it throughout the marketing campaign. In July, before the movie came out in 2015 at the San Diego Comic-Con, they rolled out the first trailer for the film. It received a standing ovation from attendees, and they requested that it be played again. On December 14th in 2015, they launched a 12 Days of Deadpool campaign that began with new images and a featurette and maybe even a new poster that would be released for the film each day by companies such as People, JoeBlow.com, Fandango, and Mashable. Videos released for the film included a public service announcement parody instructing men on how to check for testicular cancer, played during an episode of The Bachelor, holiday messages for Chinese New Year and Australia Day, a cross-promotional video with Manchester United, a video starring Betty White, random, and an appearance on Conan O'Brien where Deadpool gives Conan a massage. Ryan Reynolds also promoted the movie on social media, taking part in a faux rivalry with Hugh Jackman, which became a running gag in the film itself, and of course has come full circle with Deadpool and Wolverine now. And the campaign also took advantage of Snapchat, Tinder, and Pornhub. In the 2 weeks before the film's release, there was an average of 10,000 to 20,000 tweets about it per day, which jumped to 90,000 per day after the early screenings. And that's just scratching the surface. There were a lot of other things with this marketing campaign. I mean, it's really extensive, but it changed the game, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Like, this marketing was
Mm-hmm.
truly changing the game, and in large part is responsible for why it was so successful at the box office. What do you remember about the lead up to the movie? Just, all of the first footage, the stuff that Ryan Reynolds was doing, the really weird,
Yeah.
funny parody things that he was doing online and on social media. What do you recall just about this entire marketing campaign?
Just how it was everywhere, is what I remember. Legit everywhere. I remember the Betty White commercial of like, why is Betty White saying Deadpool is the best movie like she had ever seen or something, or like of the year? I was like, what is this? How did we get here? But it was so meta, right? And I think, everything you mentioned, like Tinder in there and Pornhub and Snapchat, like at the time, specifically Tinder and Snapchat were thriving, and this is the height of like Snapchat and Tinder
It's
in
peak for
2016.
sure.
You know what I'm saying? It's peak. People are on those apps constantly. I remember the holiday of it all. Like, I remember one of my favorite, I think, marketing tools out of this was literally just like Deadpool laying by that fireplace laying down. Like, I just remember that so vividly because I don't know, it was something about him going through the seasons or going through some of the holidays that took part because the main campaign was still like, this is coming out during Valentine's Day. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, that's genius. Of course you would go through Halloween and Christmas and all these other things before we arrived to Halloween, or we arrived to Valentine's Day. So yeah, I remember so many people just also, I guess, trying to figure out who Deadpool was. Like, if you didn't know who Deadpool was before this marketing campaign, you're like, all right, what is this? And a lot of people were just asking me questions. You know, at this time, people probably know me and you, we're already movie people at this time. Like, people are like, Dez, who is this dude? And you kind of got to explain to people who Deadpool is. And you're like, Ryan Reynolds is playing this character who's about this. He's really funny. This is why he's everywhere. But yeah, man, he just literally spanned pop culture at that time. And that's what I remember of them just keep coming out with stuff. I remember him and Hugh Jackman going back and forth in the rivalry that they were having. I was like, what is this? There's so much happening with this campaign. In fact, it felt so unprecedented. Like, nobody was doing marketing like this. Like, the MCU was not doing this. You know what I'm saying? They were not constantly doing 80 things at once. They were very much, here are interviews and trailers and other things. They were not like, let's go get Betty White to talk about this thing on the internet. You know what I'm saying? They weren't doing that. And so, yeah, I definitely remember a ton coming out of this time, man.
It was lightning in a bottle, and it was truly an inescapable marketing campaign that lends himself to the character and the hero. You know, you can't achieve this. The MCU can't do this because they don't have a character at that time in their canon that could actually go out and do these really inventive things. Like, you're not going to see Steve Rogers doing a promotional tie-in with Betty White or pop up on Conan O'Brien in costume doing any of this stuff. It just doesn't make sense. It completely destroys and almost invalidates the relationship with that character. But Deadpool, he crosses all boundaries and all lines. Like, it literally is a fourth wall breaking character. So he is going to appear to tell you, I have a movie coming out. Come see me in the movie. And I'm going to do all of these really funny things and pop up in these places that you didn't expect. And I'm just glad that they recognized and understood that they had this opportunity, because this easily could have just been an overlooked, missed thing. Like, if they just didn't take advantage of any of this. But thank God for Ryan Reynolds. Like, he truly proved to himself to be a marketing genius. And that's why we see all these years later, he's like practically a billionaire now because he has his own company. He's a marketing genius. Like, he does everything, owns companies on his own, because he just has a knack for this stuff. He has a business acumen that's pretty unparalleled when it comes to actors and talent in Hollywood. And it all really started here with Deadpool, to just recognize, like, well, what are people not doing? What are the levers that we can pull that nobody's even thought and considered to activate? Because we have a chance and an opportunity and a leeway to do those things that nobody else can do. And also, again, because they don't have a ton of money, they don't have a giant $150-200 million marketing budget at their disposal. You have to be creative. You have to figure out new ways that are going to get people excited to come out and see this movie. And ultimately, it fucking worked. I mean, it worked 10 times over, because this movie was hugely successful at the box office. As I mentioned earlier, the production budget was a mere $58 million, which is also important to note that Fox initially greenlit this budget at like $65 million, but within the last 48 hours of greenlighting the movie, they cut it down even more. They took off another $7 to $8 million off of the budget. So they gave it even less money in when they were finally ready to make it, but it was budgeted at $58 million. And worldwide, this movie made $782.8 million. It opened at number one, making $132.4 million for the opening weekend and $152 million over the long President's Day weekend. It was the highest R-rated opening of all time. It broke all records, and it ultimately became the highest grossing R-rated film of all time, ultimately dethroning The Matrix Reloaded. It's been since dethroned by not only its sequel, but of course Joker, which came out a few years ago. But at that time, it was unprecedented. It made the most amount of money that any R-rated movie ever made. And domestically, it was only behind The Passion of the Christ, which he certainly referenced in the second movie. But Deadline calculated that the net profit of the film was $322 million when factoring together all expenses and revenues for the film, making it the second most profitable movie of 2016, only behind The Secret Life of Pets. And so we're talking net profit. Like, they just walked away with $322 million. On the critical side, it was met with overwhelming response, 85% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, average score of 65 out of 100 on Metacritic, and audiences gave it an A from Cinema Score. It ended up being the 9th highest grossing movie globally that year. It was only behind Fantastic Beasts and Batman v Superman. Number 1 that year was Captain America Civil War. Number 2 was Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Other movies included there, but it was number 9 globally at the box office that year. I mean, how surprising was it to see it do this well? I think the marketing, the excitement, you started to feel that there was going to be something here. It was going to be a pretty successful movie. But I don't know if anybody, especially Fox and the filmmakers, could have predicted that it would ultimately go on to be the highest grossing rated R film of all time up until that point.
I know I wasn't ready for it. I knew it had kind of a hump to get over, one, because again, at the time, people didn't know who Deadpool was like that. Like, it wasn't, I don't know. It wasn't tied to the MCU. Of course, it was a Fox movie, but even by marketing, you could tell that it wasn't going to be a ton of XMen in it that people knew. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like Hugh Jackman was in the movie. It was super surprising for me, man. Again, that the R rating too was just like, I don't know how many people are going to see this movie, but I'll be there. It was definitely surprising. I did not see, I think, the success of this movie coming like at all. I'm happy it went that way for sure, but marketing is important. Marketing is important. You can't tell me otherwise. I think a lot of success is definitely marketing, but again, also I think wanting to see something different and seeing the trailer, seeing a lot of people seeing those early test screenings, and I think getting people's interest, man, was just a tool that they used really well, and they were able to succeed and again come out on top with a banger of the year, man. I was very proud at the time, but yeah, definitely couldn't have seen it coming.
The marketing deserves a ton of credit, and of course, the movie being good is also very important because word of mouth certainly became a thing. And I remember seeing this movie and telling so many people, you have to see this. Like, you have to go see Deadpool. Like,
you gotta go see it.
This is not like fucking Batman and Spider-Man and the Avengers. Like, this is something you have not seen before. And in a time where we were getting a lot of these types of movies, and you had your Captain Americas that year, you had your Batman v Supermans, these really flashy, huge, big name titles that were coming out, for Deadpool to do what it did in that year against that type of competition, it's unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. It became the highest grossing Fox X-Men movie of all time. This made more money than any X-Men ensemble picture. It made more money than Days of Future Past and Apocalypse and X2. Like, this was truly a phenomenon. It was really, really crazy at how successful it was. Again, I just don't think anybody could have predicted it, but there were so many factors that really played into its favor. And it's also interesting too, because this movie changed the industry on several different fronts. The next thing that I'll mention that I think it changed was the idea that movies could come out in February and make a lot of money and be successful. Before this, January and February, those were not the months you wanted to land in. Those were the dumpuary months. I still think January is dumpuary. That's still the month that hasn't overcome it. Like, there's still so much trash that comes out in January. But February is now like a destination for films to come out, because you have Valentine's Day and President's Day that can take advantage of that. And in the years following Deadpool, we saw films come out like Black Panther in 2018 and be super successful in February. Next year, we're getting Captain America Brave New World. I'm sure there's a couple of other examples there. February is now like a prime time for movies to come out and be successful and kind of kick off the year earlier than that summer blockbuster season typically would. So just an incredible showing from a film that, again, I just don't think anybody could have predicted it would do this well. When you're looking at other movies of that year, 2016, you have Captain America Civil War, BVS, Suicide Squad. Where does Deadpool rank for you in terms of just like the comic book films that we got in 2016? Because it was somewhat all over the place. You had some good ones in there, but you also had, I think, it's safe to say, some disappointing efforts that ultimately came out in 2016. But where would Deadpool fall for you in just the list of comic book films that came out that year?
It'd be number 2 for sure. I think it would go. I think Civil War still might be my favorite of the year. I think we'll go Civil War, Deadpool, and then as a third spot, if I had to pick, maybe Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange come out that year too.
Yeah.
So I would probably go with those 3 because yeah, bro, Apocalypse, no thank you. Suicide Squad, hella no thank you. BVS was very disappointing to me. Like, I'm telling you, bro, until that other cut came out, I'm again BVS. I was mad at the trailer, so I was already going into that movie like I don't know what's going on here. So yeah, bro. It was this 2016 is a disappointing year, but I think Deadpool, Civil War, and Doctor Strange were those are like my top three of that year, and I would put Deadpool at that second spot.
I was such a confused individual in 2016 because I was just all over the fucking place. Like the high highs of Deadpool followed by the really disappointing low of BVS. I mean, I remember walking out the theater and I was with friends and they were like, "I was, it was okay." And I'm like, "What the fuck did they
BVS
do to my
got
boy?
into
They
me.
massacred my boy. I felt like fucking Vito Corleone. Like, what did they do here?"
Oh,
Civil
no.
War, great stuff, amazing, one of the best films they
Yeah.
did. And then Suicide Squad, I mean, just shits the bed. Like it was all over the place that year, but I agree. Deadpool was it was the second best film from a comic book standpoint that came out that year after Captain America Civil War, but just hugely successful. Before we move on, any other favorite moments from the movie? Any favorite lines of dialogue, favorite jokes, action sequences, anything that really stands out to you? Like when you go back and watch it, you still laugh or you still enjoy seeing that particular moment in the film.
I still laugh at a lot of stuff in these movies, man. I like the whole one of the earlier sequences with the pizza boy and the other dude that he's kind of holding up and trying to get a name from. That will always be funny to me, especially the small Easter egg that the pizza box says like Feige's, whatever.
Yeah.
Like Kevin Feige's name is on it. I don't know. It's something about that being small and contained that I thought was funny. But action wise, the whole lab stuff with Ajax is kind of crazy. Like I will never forget. Like I guess seeing a lot of that stuff for the first time. I think I was so surprised that they went that in depth. I think with the character a little bit, I was like, oh shoot, no, y'all really took it to some of this lab stuff again because that is some of the interesting parts of Deadpool. But yeah, seeing like Marrow in there, Marrow, the mutant with like bone coming out of her back. I was just like, there's a lot going on in there. But yes, too many jokes to name, to be honest. Also randomly whatchamacallit being in the movie. What's her name? Angel Dust randomly being in the movie. I was like, it's funny because we see her differently now. Gina, we see her differently now. But her and what's his name? TJ
Miller.
What's his name?
Yeah.
TJ Miller.
Yeah.
We just see them so differently.
Yeah,
now.
they didn't
It's
age
so
well.
Knowing they're both in the movie.
Yeah,
they didn't age well.
Them two. Oh man,
at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, but Weasel was funny too. I know. The TJ Miller, Weasel was really funny too in the movie. Oh yes, I do remember. So some of my favorite parts in the movie is with him and Al. I think Al is hilarious. She's blind. It's also funny because she also played like the mom on Empire. I don't know how she got in these two different worlds. But here we are. She acts so much, and she will almost. I won't say she don't take anything. She has more respect than that, but she takes a lot of roles that like she's in so many different places. So I'm really happy that she took that role because I think her being blind, those are some of like my favorite jokes in the movie. To be honest, anytime he's with Al, I know I'm going to laugh.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to mention his interactions with Weasel and Blind Al. Like those are just gold, just comedy gold throughout the movie.